Everybody sees my notes.
I just remembered I have to leave to go play Borderlands.
All right. So, we good? Audio's coming through okay? Okay. Kick off? All right. No. 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 Don't tell me you got the bio.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the latest meeting of the hashtag MySec West Michigan chapter. Is that MySec?
Grand Rapids.
MySec.
Grand Rapids.
Hyphen hashtag Octothorpe MySec /GR. This is Repathur? How do you say that?
Seriously?
Presenting on PKI and US.
Picky. I like it.
PKI and US.
I like it. It is picky.
Take away a round of applause.
Picky. All right. I'm Jason. We'll talk about PKI and US, not picky. All right, so we have to start off with the obligatory intro and disclaimers. This is meant as a primer on PKI. We're going to go into a little bit of depth in it, but I assume some knowledge of PKI, but not a ton, okay? If there's questions, please ask them. This is much more fun if this is interactive. So I am by no means an expert, although I did play one on TV. That's a joke. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them. This presentation is my own. It does not reflect on past employers or future, okay? And again, if I have any information incorrect, please let me know and let's have a chat about it. So we need public key infrastructure. Great question there. So how do we use PKI in our daily lives? So we want to give kind of an intro to what PKI is, what it's used for. So we've got some examples up here on the screen. We control access to the network. Everybody here has heard of 802.1x, network authentication. One of the cool things that we use it for is network access control. We put certificates on those devices that we are connecting to our infrastructure. We also use 802.1x, great question again, Drew. 802.1x is a protocol. It's a network protocol. It's a network authentication protocol. We use it to identify those devices to our switches, our wireless servers, our wireless services. We connect, thank you. We connect it to our devices. So we use 802.1x to authenticate the end device to the network, whether it be wired or wireless. We use it also within authoring for applications and code signing. If you've heard of, who here's heard of UEFI BIOS? Everybody at this point, I hope. What that does is it actually BIOS is signed by a certificate authority so that that BIOS is safe to put into your computer. What it's being used for is to validate that it actually came from who they're attesting that they came from. ASUS, Gigabit, any of them big name motherboard manufacturers, they all have to sign their drivers and their firmware so that you know that it's safe to install, okay? Also, the Windows operating system uses this as a checksum that it says, hey, is this thing legitimate? And it, in theory, will at least help us to not install drivers loaded with malware, okay? In theory. We use it for protection of user data, EFS, encrypting file system. We use it in, everybody at this point has heard of BitLocker, right? We can use PKI as part of that. Just depends on the use case scenario that you do or do not have a certificate. Okay, we use it in protection of our IPsec tunnels and our VPNs, our virtual private network. We encrypt the traffic. We use the certificate to generate a key that we use to encrypt that traffic. But the call out there is that it is used. LDAP, everybody's heard of Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. It's what we use as an alternative to Active Directory when we're poor. Oh, that's a joke. We use it when we don't want the overhead or the attack surface of Active Directory. But the cool thing is we can do LDAP-S queries, and those secured queries rely upon PKI to facilitate that. We use it in two-factor authentication, specifically when we're using smart cards. I brought props with me, so this is a smart card reader. If anybody wants to take a look at that, feel free to. And trying to find the smart card itself, which has managed to slip down to the bottom of the bag somewhere. So I will find that later. But smart card, everybody's seen them. Hey, can somebody pull out their credit card? Joke, don't do it, please. Most newer credit cards have smart chips inside of them that will work exactly the same as a smart card. It's different in their application of it. Yep. We use it to try. Oh, everybody's seen the HTTPS with the padlock icon, right? Underneath the covers, that's dependent upon PKI. You have to have a certificate on your server so that you can attest to the server is yours, okay? We use it in implementation of secure email, signing, and encryption. So former life, I used to work for Uncle Sam, and I used a lot of PKI from the standpoint of signing my emails and or setting them up so that they could be attested that they came from me. It was signing, it was encryption, it was all sorts of fun stuff. And just as a quick transition there, you see file encryption and file decryption. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. You also see signing for code, and you also see wireless as the icons there. I know that's kind of small, so if you can't see it from there, please feel free to take a look at it in greater detail, and I can provide my slides after. Examples of encryption. We gave examples of it's being used in HTTPS, but what exactly is it? Well, let's start off defining what the acronym actually means. So great question, Drew. Public Key Infrastructure, PKI. And what does that evoke to your mind? So when I say infrastructure, go for it.
Is it an acronym if I don't say the word? Otherwise, it's individualism.
Okay, fair. So, okay, it's a great observation. What other word do you see in there? So public keys, what's that last word there?
Infrastructure.
Like all good things in IT, we have to have an infrastructure, right? So in order to support public key infrastructure, we probably need something for it to run on. So like all infrastructure, there are many parts that make it functional. We're going to talk about some of those pieces and parts. A location or a protocol, not mutually exclusive, to handle certificate validity, okay? OSCP, or OCSP, sorry, yep. Online Certificate Status Protocol and CRL, Certificate Revocation Lists, are used. They don't have to be either or. They can be used in tandem, but the typical deployment strategy is that you would see one or the other being used. We'll talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages. I believe that's later in the presentation, but if it's not, I'll come back to that, I promise. So what are the types of certificate templates involved? What's a certificate template, you asked? That's a great question. Certificate templates are simply the thing that the certificate validation goes through at the certificate authority. So when I say, hey, I want a certificate, please, Mr. Certificate Authority, I come to you with what I have, and I say, does this fit for what I intend to use it for? And the certificate authority says, yep, your algorithms check out, you're good to go, here's your certificate back. Fun fact, when you come to the certificate authority with your request, CSP, certificate signing request, CSR, it's going to be a long night. Sorry, folks. So the CSR comes to the CA. CA says, yep, you fit for what I said for template and for algorithms. You're good to go. What it does is it simply signs that certificate signing request and gives you back your certificate. Okay. When you come to the server, the certificate authority in this case, when you come to it saying, hey, I'd like a certificate, you actually already have a public-private key pair, which we'll get into in a little bit. That's important because that key material, which again we'll talk about in a little bit, is dangerous and something that needs protecting. So we want to make sure that we keep our eye on that key material, where it ends up, and clean it up, okay? Rules that a CA, certificate authority, follows for issuance of a certificate. That's the easiest definition of a template. Network segmentation considerations, what I'm saying there is we want to be mindful of where we expose these certificate authorities at. It doesn't do me a whole lot of good, nor is it advisable to publish this thing out on public internet, right? Because everybody and their brother can come after it. At that point, there's not enough protection mechanisms that warrant deploying to that location. So we want to be mindful of where we deploy this thing at. A lot of organizations will have an internal PKI for the express purpose of handling their devices. One of the cool things is, how can you get a certificate from a certificate authority that you can't touch? So the call out here is that if you don't have access to generating to submitting a CSR to a certificate authority, it can't ever generate a certificate for you to actually use. So one of the ways that we go about protecting our PKI infrastructure is we limit where it's exposed at. We're going to talk about three-tiered architecture in a little bit, which also further limits how they're interacted with. But the call out here is that you want to both think about your network segmentation before you deploy, and you also want to test and validate that that segmentation is working as you expected. Base operating system services are running on. What does that mean? It means I want to pay attention to the attack surface of the underlying infrastructure. Like all things within IT, the infrastructure is only ever as good as the infrastructure it rides on. I can have the world's most secure PKI. If I deploy it on Windows 6, and I'm seeing that somebody's going to grin or chuckle at that, they are not going to have a great time deploying and running their PKI. It's an ancient operating system at this point. There's a lot of known vulnerabilities to it. I'm not going to necessarily be able to attack the PKI, but I don't need to. I'm going to go after the other infrastructure. We also want to
Take down CA, then you take down a whole lot more.
Oh yeah, we'll get into that for sure. But yes, we can take down, so we're going to talk about three-tiered architecture, which will illuminate a lot of that. And that's why you never, ever, ever deploy on ancient for root, okay? Unfortunately, it works out that you end up with that, but there's other protection mechanisms, which we'll talk about to mitigate some of that. Hardware and physical protections and defenses. Bare minimum, whenever we're talking about deploying a PKI component, we always want to talk about HMAC TPM, and we also want to talk about good monitoring on those servers. Everybody at this point deploys EDR in their environment. This is definitely not one of those things that you want to skimp on, okay? All right, so we're deep dive. I warned y'all that this is a primer, but it does assume some subject matter expertise. So we need to talk about encryption. Specifically, we So symmetric versus asymmetric. In symmetric, I use the same key to go forward and back. Now,
That's like a zip file that you encrypt.
it is, and how secure are zip files?
Not very. They're good enough for some applications.
Exactly. So there's challenges. We're going to talk about those in a minute. So what we need to focus in on right now is what's the difference between the two. And the difference between symmetric versus asymmetric is that symmetric, again, goes forward and back. Asymmetric, on the other hand, uses one side of your key to encrypt and the other side to decrypt, okay? What does that encryption work against? Easiest example is text, but it applies to all things it is applied against. So the call out there is that encryption is applied. We typically talk about clear text versus cipher. Private side of my asymmetric key pair, and I would send it to you, and you would take my private or my public side of my certificate and decrypt it in order to actually validate that it was from me. The reason that that works is because those key pairs are matched. It also all falls apart if for any reason my private side of my certificate is ever exposed, which is why you want to be very careful with that key material. Okay, a great question. So why, if asymmetric and symmetric have these characteristics, why would I ever choose symmetric, right? It seems like there's all these challenges and limitations. Also of note, one of the key, sorry, not pun intended, one of the key pieces that we need to be mindful of with asymmetric is that an exposure of one is an exposure of all, okay? When Esquire has a public-private key pair, okay, he has the ability to use that key to attest to stuff from him, right? If Dan, you get exposed, your key pair is exposed. Is Esquire's key compromised? For asymmetric. For symmetric, though, Esquire and Dan share a key. Dan's key is exposed. Is Esquire's as well? See where we're going with this? So the practical example is that asymmetric key pairs, you have to coordinate key distribution to all those involved in the usage of that key, okay? There's an upshot to symmetric though, and it's fast. That's the biggest upshot. So what we typically do is we deploy asymmetric on top of symmetric. As an example, when you go ahead and negotiate TLS, what you're actually doing is you're using both because you're using the asymmetric encryption to encrypt the symmetric key in that stream, at least for not PFS stuff. But the call out there is that you're using both, not just the one, okay? Now, why choose one or the other? So we've got a quick table here. We'll run through it real fast. How many keys in symmetric? Because it uses that same key forward and back. And asymmetric? Cool. What happens if key material is compromised? Well, on the symmetric, you're all screwed. Oh, sorry, bad joke. In practicality, though, unfortunately, that's what it boils down to. You're going to be coordinating getting a new key set out to all of the parties involved in an symmetric key compromise. In an asymmetric, on the other hand, you only have to coordinate one person gets their new key pair, okay? How are keys utilized? In symmetric, same key is used to encrypt and decrypt, like we talked about previously. In asymmetric, however, public key is used to encrypt, private key is used to decrypt, or it's important to remember that there's two different use cases, or private key is used to encrypt while the public key is used to decrypt, okay? Is key distribution synchronization required for asymmetric? Is it required? Why? Because not everyone is using it. Symmetric, on the other hand, I have to coordinate it because if Drew uses my symmetric key pair and Esquire uses it and they don't match, what happened? Exactly, it's useless, okay? Now, computational load. This is where you win, okay? When it comes to using asymmetric versus symmetric, you win by the fact that on computational load, you're not taking much of a hit to run a symmetric algorithm. Okay. In an asymmetric, on the other hand, it's medium to heavy load on proc to decrypt and encrypt. Okay. Primary use case for symmetric, we already talked about this, but for symmetric encryption, we use it in a lot of bulk encryption. In asymmetric, we encrypt the symmetric key in bulk. The key for the symmetric key is encrypted using asymmetric encryption so that we can get the benefit of the speed of handling a bulk algorithm, but then we also get the benefit of the security of the asymmetric key pair. Everybody tracking? Cool. So we've talked about how we use certificates. We've talked a little bit about the infrastructure. We've talked a little bit about the differences in encryption algorithms. Now we actually get to define what a certificate is. So what exactly is it? Typically, when we talk about certificates, we're talking about X509. This is from RFC 5280. Everybody's heard of RFCs at this point. IEEE, right? Some great reading. If you're having trouble sleeping, it will help you out immensely, okay? But it goes through all the theory, the practicals, all of that. With RFCs 2459, 3280, and 3647 having been superseded mainly by the 5280. Okay. At its core, it is simply an asymmetric key pair signed by a certificate authority from a certificate signing request. Like we talked about earlier, we will now get to talk about how we actually validate this. Now, quick refresher. Certificate signing request, again, when I go to a certificate authority and ask for a certificate, I bring it my key pairs, okay? And my key pair is presented to it via that CSR. That CSR is then signed by the certificate authority. I get certificate back. Normally, what's part of the infrastructure is a pickup location as well as a lot of authentication and role-based access control so that when Esquire asks for a new certificate from the certificate authority, he's got a pickup location, he's got an account that he has to use to authenticate to that certificate authority so that he can actually get his certificate to import it into his key store, okay? We'll talk about key stores a little bit later. But for right now, let's now transition to talking about certificate chaining. So what is it and why do we care? Well, when I go to browse to www.yahoo.com, right? I haven't specified whether it's HTTP or HTTPS. If I'm browsing to HTTP, what's one of the problems with browsing in the clear? There we go. It's just encoded. It's just encoded in HTML, right? So the call out is, well, it's encoded in other languages too. There's scripts, there's all sorts of stuff going on, but the call out is it's all in the clear. HTTPS, on the other hand, establishes an encrypted session. The call out there is what did we talk about? We said that we use asymmetric key pairs to encrypt symmetric keys so that I protect that session, okay? There's all sorts of stuff that goes on to how those session keys are derived. That's outside the scope of this. We won't talk about that, but the call out is that at the end of the day, at its most simplest implementation, we typically see a symmetric key pair being encrypted inside of an asymmetric key pair that negotiates so that we get that session key established, okay? When we talk about PFS, we're talking about individual sessions. Don't forget, old school thought was that those sessions are shared, unfortunately. Where's the problem with that? A compromise of one is a compromise of all, okay? But that's outside the scope of this topic, or this talk. So let's talk about certificate chaining. When I go to browse to yahoo.com, how do I trust that that certificate that says this is yahoo.com isn't fibbing, right? Everybody's heard of self-signed certificates. Yes, no? And they're the scourge of the devil. I mean, they're awesome. I mean, they're everywhere. They are easy. It depends. Okay. They're good or they're bad? Mm-hmm. If you got nothing else, they're better than the nothing else. Yeah. Yes, you hit one of the biggest challenges the industry faces. Thank you. I appreciate that. I was trying to tiptoe through the minefield and you just threw a rock in there. So the call out is, yes, that is one of the biggest challenges. So IoT, OT, whatever you want to talk about, yeah, they typically deploy self-signed certificates. Everybody's familiar with ILOs. Has everybody heard of those? Integrated lights out devices, or what's IBM's IMM? Oh, iDRAC. Wait, is iDRAC Dell or IMM is? Okay. Yeah, sorry. The IMM one. IBM is IMM. What is it? Okay. And
Something that I hope you hit on is why less encrypted is the greatest option.
so let's talk about that one, but not in this talk. So there are, to summarize, good points. OT, IT, whatever you want to call it, we're going to just say devices certificate, right? A lot of times they're self-signed, unfortunately for us, okay? That's not necessarily good or bad. I'm going to be in camp bad pretty much all day, every day, because I've dealt with it. But the call out is that those self-signed certificates at the end of the day are better than nothing. And we typically run into the challenge of that self-signed certificate was generated from whoever the device manufacturer was, okay? I'm going to use the HP ILO example, okay? My browser, does it trust that self-signed certificate? By default, I should point out. Yeah, don't go down that path. Please don't use self-signed certificate. No, just no. Don't do self-signed certificates on a domain. We'll talk about better solutions. Go for it.
Do we trust the Yahoo certificate because we trust the certificate authority signer?
So that's where we get to segue into certificate chaining. Thank you. So how do we trust that though? So Yahoo purchases from a root CA. That's an important designation. Root CAs are the public things inside of your either browser or operating system or both. Okay. These root CAs are trusted, whether it be Microsoft operating system, whether it be Firefox, Chrome, whether it be the key store of the operating system exposed via the browser, i.e. Edge, i.e. sorry, that was a bad example. Internet Explorer also did it, but the point of this is that the key store already has that root certificate in it, and that's how you can perform chaining. So what is chaining? It validates all of the certificates throughout the chain. So when you talk about a public certificate authority, you're typically talking about a 3-tiered architecture. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, so I'm going to hold off on that. But the call out is that it's got a root trust anchor that's already in your key store for whatever the thing is, whether that be the browser or the operating system. And it goes through an issuing CA to a certificate that was actually issued from that issuing CA. And that certificate can be trusted because it chains all the way up to a root that was already stuffed in your key store. Does that make sense? Okay. Period of validity matters. When you stand up that root CA, you're going to be dealing with that thing for a long darn time. Pick as robust and as heavy as you can manage with regards to the algorithms, with regards to the bit key sizes that you are using for them. Go as advanced as you can from a computational load, because you're not typically going to be deploying a ton of issuing intermediary CAs. The goal is that that root CA is turned off after you have generated the keys for your intermediary CAs. And the reason is, can you hack what's off?
No.
And do we want to have physical controls around the thing that's off? Abso-friggin-lutely. And we want to make it a very robust, multifaceted security system that even allows you to get at that root CA to generate new certificates for intermediary CAs, okay? Typically what you'll see is I build my root CA, I give 5 people access, I give them access via smart cards, and I take all 5 people's access and I lock them in a safe. And typically for fault tolerance, you have what's called a quorum of those 5 individuals need to be present to bring that thing online. You can change it. Different certificate authorities allow for different functionalities. Prime Key that we were using did a really cool thing, I thought, with regards to how they initialized a lot of their slots, but that's outside the scope of this talk. The call out here is that typically what you'll see is some very robust authentication and authorization mechanisms at play with regards to root CA being able to stand up an intermediary CA. Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, so again, to wrap it all up nice and neat in a bow, what is certificate chaining? It's validating all certificates throughout that chain. The period of validity matters. The last piece that I didn't talk about yet is cipher suite selection matters. Everybody remembers, and here's Drew's little plug, what about hashing? Okay, they use different algorithms to calculate values of certificates, right? Is SHA as good of a hashing algorithm as SHA-2? Okay, why? Because there's, yeah, well done, well done. Golf clap for that. The problem that we have is that those algorithms were found to have collisions, okay? Is one of the attack vectors. There's other stuff, timing, channel attacks, all sorts of fun stuff that we can do to hashing algorithms. Now, I want to draw a quick compare and contrast. Encryption, hashing. Encryption is which? One-way or two-way? Okay, what's hashing? Okay, why is that important? I'll take that. So the hashing of the thing tells me that it hasn't been modified, hasn't been manipulated, hasn't had something done to it. The encryption, on the other hand, what does that give me? It gives me the gives me confidentiality, gives you privacy, gives you the ability to say, hey, I don't think anybody else was able to even touch this thing in transit. It gives you that ability to say, this is hopefully secure, private, confidential. Also, as an ancillary thing, don't depend on it, but as an ancillary thing, it also gives you non-repudiation because I am, oh, what happened? I'm sorry. I think it was. And I don't remember my password. Yeah, no. So we're going to have to pause there because I don't remember. I completely spaced on the fact that I didn't have the password with me. No. So Esquire, I'm going to stop there and then I'm going to rejoin it, okay? Sorry about that. Yeah. So because of the streaming, it's got the camera. So I'll bounce it and rejoin here.
All right, so what's the solve?
There's going to be a short pause here.
I don't have any.
Oh, what's the?
What was your question?
Why are we salty about using Let's Encrypt versus using a self-signed certificate?
That was an honest question.
Because you fill it out, and it's like they're like, okay, say who you are.
Well,
say
are you-
who and that's all they require.
I know it's not-
If you use something like Trust,
Yep.
then if you go through more sets of applications, say, here's
Yeah.
what company that is out, here's our website, here's all the ways.
Right, but that's versus Entrust signing an actual certificate.
That's
That's for self-signed.
No, it's not.
So what if your company doesn't take any money, you don't have any certificate right now, you're
What
actually
if
setting
it's
up
on
a
router?
certificate?
It's you.
Like I'm at my home router. and
You
it's
give
certificate.
them root say.
So call the Hong Kong post office. Say,
Oh.
I need a certificate, and then I can transfer money.
Oh,
Yes,
it's an,
yes,
it's
I
an
know.
You
honest,
say, hey, actual establish here, will you co-sign my root so I can
Hong
start?
Kong
issuing-
post office is in every
That's-
browser.
that's-
on the planet.
We'll talk about that
You know,
real quick.
Hong Kong.
so when you say self-signed certificate, you're not saying, no, when you're saying they're bad, you're not saying it's bad if you get it signed by a third.
Let it go down.
If
If it's signed by a third party, it's not self-signed anymore.
But then you can sign your own.
Hold up.
If you go to the website, that's public, and it's sometimes everyone's gonna go, and Google's like, oh, we don't trust this guy, but here's the server. You-
Just fine.
And everybody goes to your website and they're like, I trust that.
And that's
They
exactly
do
the
the credit
problem.
card deal.
I think I'm thinking of it from like a marketing and like manufacturing standpoint.
How about from a phishing standpoint? If I have a secret signed website, go to command.nl/Google, and put in your Google credentials.
He'll be back soon.
Be my guest.
I mean.
So, The conversation is about using Let's Encrypt versus a PKI.
Or my domain. Certified, automatically authenticates my servers because I've run out of tech.
Welcome back, Jason.
Mitigate the issue that it's like a 60 day.
So let's cover this in the presentation now that we got connected back up. I appreciate it. All right, you got audio from me still, Esquire? All right. Yep. Thank you, sir. All right. So off camera and outside of presentation, the question came out of can I summarize it, of what's the benefit to using Let's Encrypt over a self-signed certificate? Okay. So the benefit to Let's Encrypt, what?
I was gonna say, I was asking you a question.
And then why shouldn't you?
Some salt from over there.
What's
Got it.
another option that's low cost for-
Got it. Yep. So yeah. PKI from most people's perspective is something that you do want to invest in. Now, the call out here is Let's Encrypt. The cool thing about it is it gives you a certificate that chains to a root CA. Awesome. However, the use case for Let's Encrypt is where the problem comes in. Let's Encrypt's entire premise for keeping certificates secure is I'm just going to keep it real short period of validity. I'm going to give you 30, 60, 90 days, and then I'm rolling your certificate. Okay? The problem with that is if I want to do HSTS, can I do that against your site? What's HSTS? Ah, crap. What's the acronym stand for? Brooks? No? Okay. Yep. There's one more word. Host security transport. No, what is it? It's CRUD. Yeah, the translation for it is, though, I pin a certificate, and if it doesn't come from that certificate authority, I throw a flag. The browser says, and Apple is notorious for this, it smacks you down. That's pretty much, yeah, it smacks you down pretty hard. Thank you, HTTP strict transport security. That's awesome. What? What's that? What? Certificate revocation lists work just fine, thank you very much. It's just that they're abused and not used. And if you're krill skewing, you are an awful person and you are abusing the protocol. Yeah. So the cool thing about HSTS is that it pins and says, hey, unless you're from this known certificate authority, your certificate, even if it is valid, bye-bye, okay? Ding, ding, ding. There has to be a mechanism to provide that update to your customers, and that's where the problem comes in with Let's Encrypt, because there's no mechanisms there, okay? The Let's Encrypt certificate, though, its entire use case is we're going to keep this thing secure simply by rolling it real frequently. So again, you go out there and you sign up. You don't give them any validation that you actually represent the organization that you attest that you do, okay? So there's very limited validation as well. So it depends on how they do it. Most of the times it's a text record in your DNS. But if you pop that server, do you have access to the DNS records that you can go in and put a text record in for it? Pretty easily. So you're going to be able to roll that thing to whatever you want, and then you can see all the traffic. And that's not great. So it gets you better than the fact that it's just a self-signed certificate, which, again, you're trusting that because it says to. But at the end of the day, why are you trusting a root CA? Because it says to. Yeah. Exactly. We do. So at the end of the day, a root CA, it stood up as a self-signed certificate, to your point. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with a self-signed certificate. There's a lot of things wrong with how we end up using them, though. In a root CA environment, I've got all of these robust controls. I've taken that thing offline. I've locked up all the authentication mechanisms to that machine. I have limited how many people have access to it. There's a lot of pieces and parts to it that help to enhance the security of it, because at the end of the day, we always talk about defense in depth. We need to make sure that we protect our certificates, our key material, all of that stuff at the end of the day. On Let's Encrypt, where does that stuff live? It's out on some server. Okay, you probably generated the key pair from an OpenSSL that you generated on your desktop. How secure is that? Exactly. If you're, yeah, it became so much more secure. Well done. Sorry. All right, so we covered chaining, right? Any questions about cipher suite selection, period of validity, validating that the certificate is validated, validating the certificate through the hop in the chain, okay? So cipher suite selection, we talked about SHA-1 versus SHA-2. We talked about different algorithms. If you have the ability to, don't use older, antiquated. If I say, hey, my certificate's generated with RC4, brah, it's great, right? Yes. So, God, sorry. So the answer to that is no, it's not great, okay? If you use older algorithms, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of attacks against the older ones. DES, triple DES, RC4. What's that? Correct, yeah. Let's not go down that one. That's more fun. and sitting on the working groups generating the cipher. Yeah, never mind. We're not going down that path. So what's a key store? I mentioned it a couple of times now. A key store can be thought of as a digital lockbox. It contains those keys or certificates. Usually it uses a certificate to protect the contents of the key store. So smart cards, shocker, they have a key store on them. Cool. That smart card's key store is protected by a certificate that was already generated on that device. Now, I'm hearing you over there with, oh, it's a self-signed certificate, right? Sort of. It's unique to each individual smart card is the cool saving grace component of it. And it's typically got an authentication mechanism baked into it. When I authenticate to that smart card's key store, I am typically providing it a set of credentials, a PIN, a password, something. So it's protected key store space is the call out there. Smart cards are physical devices containing key stores. There's examples here. There's pinout diagrams. You can find all this stuff online. DEF CON, gosh, it's really old at this point, but they did this cool demonstration on smart card compromise where they took and looked at it under a scanning electron microscope after they had burned away the substrate so that they could see the traces on it. And then they were playing around with how they actually went about bypassing a lot of the protection mechanisms. So I think it was DEF CON around 2008, 9, 10, somewhere in that range, if you want to go look up a real cool topic. So what certificate file formats are there out there? So there's PFX, P12. This one is important. Why? So this is the only one that allows for password protecting if you want to encrypt out, or if you want to share it out, I should say. CER or CERT, base64 encoded or DIR encoded binary X509 certificate. The CRIL, certificate revocation list that we talked about earlier. Certificate signing request.csr is the extension on file when you're sending it up to server to get your certificate signed. .dir encoded binary X509 certificate, and P7B or P7R or SPC cryptographic message syntax standard. The again, call out is that on that P12 personal information exchange format, this is the one that allows you to put a password on it and extract it and send it to other people. Go.
So in the real world, what would we normally be dealing with in our main, job?
It depends on your main job. Good Lord willing, you're not touching any of these file formats directly. You are typically interacting with the certificate authority or putting it into the key store, but you're typically not doing it a whole bunch. If you find this type of material, you want to be mindful of where you found it, preserve it. I'm assuming you're talking about a penetration test and some sort of an engagement, in which case you want to notate where it was found, you want to notate what format it was in, and on the P12s, like I mentioned, those require a password, but there's nothing that enforces a good password. And unfortunately, if you break that password, what do you have access to then? Typically that certificate, or worse, that keychain, okay?
Does it require a password?
P12 does require a password, but again, there's nothing requiring it to be a good password, unfortunately. So lots of times, unfortunately, people do 1, 2, 3 and hit enter. So I can neither confirm nor deny that that's been observed. So yeah, God, I hate that. Yeah. What's that?
What if you forget the password? Say you have a wildcard certificate for an organization.
Oh.
It's in that format, and you weren't the original person to sign the certificates or get the certificates, but you have a zip file with that file in it, and you don't know the password.
So, okay. So you've got a P12 of a wildcard certificate for an entire domain, is what I'm hearing you say?
Sure.
Okay. And you don't know the password to it. Do you have control of the backend issuing authority?
No, say the backend authority,
Okay.
say GoDaddy or...
Yeah. So I'm going to say something kind of controversial, and you feel free to disagree with me. But in this instance, I would say don't do anything with it. Kill it, get rid of it, reissue it. Because if you found it sitting off unmanaged, we'll call it, and you have to assume breach, right? You have to assume compromise. So I would always operate on the mindset of, well, I don't know where this came from. I can't attest to who had access to it at any point in time. I would rather take the headache now of having to coordinate getting that thing reissued, as painful as that is and as much as that's going to suck, I would rather go through that pain than find out that I cracked the password, I've got access to it, it's awesome, and it was compromised. So my recommendation would be kill it, purge it with fire, move on with your day, generate a new certificate. Especially because of the wildcard thing, because the wildcard's blast radius is not limited to a singular server. It's the freaking domain. And by the way, don't do that, people, because that's just not good practice. Wildcard certificates, as useful as they are a blessing and a bane, because the problem you run into is the coordination of deploying new certificate pairs. I can neither confirm nor deny that a former organization chose to reissue existing wildcard certificate, adding additional content to it, putting it on new devices. That's bad juju. Don't do that. Okay? I'm not going to say it. Shh. So, certificate structure. Since its inception in 1998, yeah. So it goes back a little ways. 3 versions of the X509 public certificate standard have evolved. As shown by the following illustration, each successive version of the data structure has retained the fields that existed in the previous versions and added more functionality to it. The following topics discuss the available fields in more detail. I lifted this directly off of Microsoft's PKI guide, so check it out. Version 1, as you can see, it covers version, serial number, signature algorithm, identifier, issuer name, validity period, subject name, also known as SAN, and public key information. In version 2, they added the issuer unique ID and the subject unique ID. Should look familiar, right? Suid. On version 3, they added the extensions, aka what's this thing able to be used for. Okay. Also bear in mind, don't forget, lots of people are real fond of issuing for a specific extension for a specific use case and then completely ignoring the darn thing and doing whatever the heck they want. So keep that in mind. All right, so we talked about this before. When we say I'm wanting a certificate, I'm generating a certificate signing request, but as I mentioned earlier, I already have my key pair. I'm cautioned y'all that when you generate a CSR, where's your key pair live? In the, what's that? So when I'm generating a CSR to send up to the issuing CA, where does that key pair get generated at? Ah, I'm hearing you now. The private. Yeah, the private part. That's great advice your mama gave you. It stays on wherever it was issued from is what Drew's getting at. Exactly. And what's worse, there are utilities for devices that exist that allow you to generate key pairs on them. F5, I'm not talking about any specific people. F5, excuse me. They generate on devices. So the call out there is that F5 has that key material on it, okay? It's also got some really slick utilities for sending it elsewhere, which is in direct violation of how keys are supposed to be handled. So keep that in mind. Your mileage may vary. Different versions of the software do different things. But the call out there is that when you generate that key pair, you generally want to either destroy it when you're done with it, or at least move it and make sure that it's in the key store so that it can be properly protected. Okay? The thing that got stolen all the time? Are you referring to Bitcoin or are you referring to certificates? Okay. Okay. So yeah, we'll leave that one be. There's also a concept, again, we don't talk about it in this presentation, but key escrowing is an important topic. And the reason that it's important is if you ever lose control of certificates, you have a backup at that point. Okay. We're not going to talk about it a lot just because I haven't done a ton with it. And the use cases are very narrow as far as when you want to generate that because you want to run that risk of exposing that key material there.
It's maybe a really dumb question because I don't know PKI very well. So you have that key pair goes to the CSR.
Mhm.
CSR becomes certificates. If you lose your CSR
Uh-huh.
and if you lose access to the certificate, can and you use that original key pair to get the exact same end service.
So let me back you up a little bit. When you said that's the key pair goes into the CSR, that's where I want to pause. What did we say about public-private key pairs? Should the private side go anywhere?
No.
Okay, so private side should be staying in key store. Public side should be what's going up. When you have that PEM encoding, you have a base 64 DER, DER, that encoded certificate request is what you're presenting as the CSR. So the issuing CA says, here's your CSR with this information about your certificate. And all it's doing is saying, hey, you did follow what I asked for in the certificate template. So you get a certificate. I'm just signing it with which side again? Public or private from the issuing CA?
Well,
Signed from the private because I used the public to decode it. Okay, so that issued CA that comes back to you at that pickup location is out on the issuing CA in some storage location. So again, the private key should never exit the key store. That's what keeps it secure. That's why we talked about key material and where it's derived at. Now, again, remember us talking about the P12? It packs all of it up, public and private, which is why it's so darn dangerous and why we want the password to be set on it. That's enforced. However, there's nothing, unfortunately, enforcing that you don't choose a crap password, right? So the P12 format is what I would typically use to extract, to send from, I generate this thing on my local workstation, I generate a P12 file, I password protect it, I send it to my server, and my server is where I put it into the key store. I then am able to use that certificate there. But the key material lives both on my local workstation, God forbid, and on the server that I put it on, okay? So typically what I counsel people on is delete the key material after you've generated the CSR. But that's where key escrowing and other functionality comes into play, okay? Does that make sense?
ish.
Okay.
Going up at the top.
Okay. All right. So we've talked a lot about CAs, but we haven't actually defined it. CAs are certificate authorities. We've talked enough to describe that part. But what exactly are they? These are the meat and potatoes of how certificates actually function. Again, I talked about a three-tiered architecture. What a CA does, a certificate authority, is it is concerned with all of the functionality of authenticating a user and of getting a certificate in that user's hands for usage. So components that you get your certificate from, it is the component that you get it from. Typically, they have mechanisms in place for getting your certificates to you, i.e. a pickup location, whether that be a published NAS, SAN, God, I hope not. But there's different options out there for where you can pick up from, okay? Web dev, don't anybody swear at me. That would be, yeah, thanks. That would be an awful selection. Recommendation on the CA is that you have an HSM. What are HSMs? They're hardware security modules. Now, what's a TPM versus an HSM? A TPM is a trusted platform module. It's a secure storage location for key material, but there's one big difference between an HSM and a TPM, and that is the fact that the HSM has mechanisms in place to detect attempted breach of key storage location. HSM destroys key material as part of its observed actions against it, whereas a TPM is like, hey, come at me, and doesn't do a darn thing. Exactly. Questions, comments, concerns? HSM. We like to fight back. Since they're the ones issuing certificates as per certificate templates, they're the component that comes under attack, issuing and intermediary, okay? Again, why did we take that root CA offline? Because it can't come under attack. And so you have the buffer zone of, yeah, you can compromise our issuing CA or our intermediary CA, but you can't get at root to create a new intermediary or a new issuing from the intermediary that you stood up. So theoretically, issuing CA comes under attack. It can potentially be compromised. We'll get into that with DigiNotar, which is a great example of what happens, but we will talk about that at that point. So questions, comments, concerns about what a CA is. So I've talked a couple of times now about three-tier architecture. Say what? Why do I want an offline root CA? Again, it protects it. So what do those intermediary CAs do then? You think of them as a buffer. These are your new root CAs at this point. These are what you go to spin up new issuing CAs, new certificate authority functionality. You can have regional authorities for authentication, for generating content so that you can authenticate and authorize people to this infrastructure. That's what all of this does. The question is, so these intermediary CAs are important, but what protections should I put on them? Everything you can. You want them to have your EDR, you want them to have an IPS, IDS, at least monitoring the lines to and from it. And again, deployment location matters in this case. Intermediary CAs, you do not want to have just sitting on regular user space. There's no reason to, because again, what's communicating with them? Not users. Good Lord, not users. Issuing CAs are what are communicating with intermediaries. And I'd much rather that you have a policy that spins up connectivity through that network segment, that enclave, to that intermediary CA than have you exposing direct user space to the intermediary CA, because there's no reason to do it. Okay. So we talked already about what are issuing CAs and why they matter. This is where you actually go with your CSR and have your certificate template validated, that you adhere to all the things and get the certificate back. All right. So has anybody heard of DigiNotar? Okay. No? Because they're dead. Okay. They went defunct many, many years ago. They were popped in 2011, and I want to say by 2012 they were bankrupt. Okay, why do we talk about them? Because if you don't build your certificate authority securely, you will suffer the consequences. What are the consequences? Well, going out of business is probably pretty bad, right? They were breached, and they are a poster child for what goes wrong in PKI. Everybody's heard the awful statistics in our industry that how long do breaches typically go before they're detected? Well, based upon lots of different people's perspectives, it's anywhere from 6 months to 18 months, and it's been shifting. I don't have Poneman's most recent study done, so I don't recall off the top of my head what's present for 2022. All I do know is that it's typically a little bit of time, okay? I would be confident saying most breaches are probably around 6-ish months, 8 months, somewhere in that range, at least recently with the advent of all the cool tools that we've got. But the call out here is that all of their issuing CAs were compromised, all 8 of them. They were lacking in security controls. They had no off-server logging. Everybody's familiar with that concept? Do I trust logs on the box that just got popped? Exactly. Initial breach was a web server. Hey, that's funny. Back in 2011, that sounds like a playbook from last year, don't it? So I drop a web shell. Initial breach was a web server where the adversary then laterally moved. They always do. Had network segmentation, but it wasn't validated. So they spent the time and effort to go through figuring out how to do network segmentation and then never validated that it was working well or tightened the screws on it to make sure that everything was enacted, okay? Had network segmentation, but it wasn't validated and enforced strong enough. Adversary claimed to be one criminal, one, not a group, one hacker. And I want to stress, hacker does not equal criminal. This guy did illegal things. They can still call themselves a hacker, but they also get to put on the hat of criminal, okay? Was in the network undetected for only 6 weeks. Again, what's the average dwell time? Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 months. It's a losing game if you don't build securely. They were popped in 2011. They don't exist, and I don't believe it took them even a full year to go bankrupt. Now, they're a little bit different because they had, was it Sweden or Denmark's, a lot of government certificates for a lot of their infrastructure is why they went defunct so darn fast, because they had such a big market segment of government contract with them being other countries. And like I said, they went kaput like that. Thanks for listening to me. Sorry for rambling. It's my contact information. Thanks for letting me chat. Have a good one. Any questions? What's that?
So about those alternatives that are 0
So we love to throw shade at Microsoft, right? Back in the late 90s, everybody's heard of Stride at this point, right? Spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and help me out, what's E? Anybody? I can't remember off the top of my head. Esquire, yes, the Esquire effect, I like it. Back in the late 90s, they had this great big security, I don't know, revolution, evangelization, all the above. If anybody hasn't taken a look at it, take a look for a tool called Threat Modeler, right? Yeah, Microsoft's threat modeling tool. It's just Google it. Don't trust my word for it. Take a look and find the link to it. But it's a free download and it helps you to threat model. It's a fantastic tool. They finally yanked it out of Visio, thank God. So you don't have to pay for it. But the cool thing about the threat modeling tool, what's that? Is it really? Awesome. I just pay for it. But the call out here is that as much shade that we throw at Microsoft, they've done a really, really good job of upping their security game. And one of the cool things that came about from that is that Active Directory has been under increased scrutiny. So we used to say that PKI and AD was a null starter. Since a couple of years ago, that's become much more viable as an option. So when I say free, I mean already sunk cost into your infrastructure you've already got there. So that's piece one. Part two is you can still use Let's Encrypt. That's fantastic. But, and here's the big caveat, do not use it for your public websites, the stuff that represents your brand and is much more than just a certificate on a server. It's your reputation on the line. As an example, previous employer had Let's Encrypt certificates for main website. And we had to have a very long, candid conversation about the fact that this is great if you're just hosting static content, but you've also got Let's Encrypt certificates that are on the redirect to portals, customer portals. That's not okay. Because what happens when that certificate has to be revoked? Oh, that transport goes down. So it's a give and take. You got to pay attention to where you're going to use it. And if your use case doesn't justify the cost of paying for a certificate authority and going down full-fledged PKI route, then don't. But at that point, it's much more a risk assessment and a business case justification of, do you want me to spend $4,000? And to put things in perspective, certificates from a public certificate authority aren't that expensive. Everybody makes it out like they're thousands of dollars. Yeah, they are for extended validation ones, but nobody said you had to do that. You can go out and buy a cheapo one for, God, $200 for a single server. So it doesn't have to be cost prohibitive.
So what about for like large scale deployments or something? Would it be fine to, in your eyes, to get to like build a certificate authority and get it by like an actual certificate authority, and that's the issue where you're fine?
So that's a good question, and that segues into one of the components to PKI. Don't forget, there's public and private, right? You internal business, why don't you just deploy your certificate authority to the root of the key store of the devices that, oh, you issued that? Huh, don't you have control of that perhaps? So the call out there, I apologize, I'm being theatric. The call out is that you've got control of it. Pump it into the key store and manage your own private certificate authority and avoid all those costs, because you're still going to be in Microsoft's pocket when it comes to having deployed an Active Directory in your environment. So why not leverage that to build out a PKI? And because you control all of those servers, put those computer devices in Active Directory. Great question, so. Anybody else?
For general website certificates, do you have a go-to provider to recommend? Is GoDaddy fine, or should you go to something?
So that's a great question. And I apologize to do this to you, but again, it depends. It depends on what you're running. I personally would feel just fine using GoDaddy to give me a certificate as long as that website's hosting static content. If it's stuff dynamically driven from my internal backend systems, then I potentially do want to pony up for more enhanced validation and all that stuff. Because GoDaddy, the only extent that they do when they issue certificates is, do you own the domain? And like I said, you put a text record in and that's validation, cool. Whereas with an Entrust data card or a Talus or any of those types of bigger name issuing certificate authorities, they go through an enhanced verification process where they say, hey, you say you're from company X, give me something that proves you're from company X. You have to be on my approved list of people that can even request a certificate in the first place. Show me that the machine that you're putting that certificate on is going on this particular server. There's a whole bunch of mechanisms that I would say that it makes sense to pony up the cache at that point.
Love to consult that.
Are you talking about SSL Labs or are you talking about, okay.
SSLs.com. They are like, they kind of go up this.
Yeah.
You can get like extended domain.
Yep.
I just understood it because like I still have to go to Secretary to like
Mhm.
my certificate and everything. But I was wondering if they basically just a reseller. If you're familiar.
I am familiar. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know if they're issuing from themselves or not. Also, we didn't really talk about it, but don't forget that we talked about Active Directory integrated certificate authorities, PKI. The call out is that you don't have to do that. There's places like Prime Trust that sell full-fledged devices. I'm sorry, I still love those guys and gals. They had some really cool tools and some awesome hardware. So the call out there is that you can spend as much or as little as you want to. The expertise to manage that is where you're really going to want to put in the time and effort, because you can have the world's best PKI. If you don't have somebody competent enough to manage it, it's moot.
So you're basically saying just evaluate what you're protecting, and if it's like just basic, you know, if it's just like a separate thing around like an AWS
Mhm.
system somewhere, go for not sometimes, go for.
Don't forget, AWS does certificates inside of it as well.
Yeah.
And I would say, yeah, use that if you have a service in the side of AWS that doesn't have any need to connect back to your infrastructure and it's completely disconnected from you. Be perfectly fine to use that. Or even if it is connected to you, as long as you've properly secured it, probably fine. Again, thank you.